Today we're going to go through the Studio One version 2 signal flow, and this is a diagram that I put together, and I would hopefully try to explain it to you so it's a little easier to understand. It's called a logical flow, and it logically flows through one unique path through the system, and this can be repeated for as many channels as you wanted to have. But I wanted to try to explain it to people so that they could try to understand it and use it better. We'll start with the audio first. In this demo here, I'm actually going to be using a drum machine to demonstrate. So a drum machine will be coming in my inputs. The first place it actually enters into the Studio One software is a window called the Input Setups. That is accessed via this I/O button right here. Audio Input Setup, and we'll bring that up, and here you see you've got an Input tab and an Output tab. So this is where you're mapping your physical audio interfaces into your logical names used within the Studio One software. Now I'm actually using an Audio Box 1818 VSL for this demonstration, but you could use any interface that you already have, or it should work fine. There's a few exceptions that you can do with PreSonus hardware, such as zero latency monitoring, but for the most part, any interface would work. So let's go ahead and once that comes in, then the first thing it does is you can see a signal here. This is actually the drum signal coming into the system. We can't hear it yet, but you can see it coming into the system, and I'll show you what that looks like on the diagram. It's actually showing up here, and first thing I want to talk about is these inserts. Now, inserts are prior to this meter, and what would these inserts be used for? These inserts are used if you want to print the actual effect onto the disc, and there are some occasions where you might want to print a particular strange effect or something onto the disc. Let's say you want to do a distorted 8-bit type sound, or if you want to put a heavy reverb onto it or something, and there's a certain effect that you're absolutely looking for, and you're not really interested in the original character of the audio signal. Think of it like a picture or a Photoshop or something like that, where you take the picture, you typically want to take the picture and save it exactly how the camera recorded it, and then apply effects on to the picture afterwards. But there are cases where you might want to apply the effect to the picture and only use it in that perspective, and that's what these inserts are used for. So let's just show you that they're actually after in setup and before the meters. There in the flow. I've stuck a few plugins on the insert, and the way you access these inserts, if you just double click the line, you'll see the insert, and here you see the signal of the drums coming in, and you see it here as well. So these are identical signals. So if I go ahead and trim this down now, I've actually reduced the volume here. So this could be used as an input trim if you had an input that you couldn't actually control. But by dimming this, you can see that this meter is reacting to it, so that means that it's after it in the flow. So if we go back over to look at the picture, sure enough, so by dimming it here, we're actually reducing the volume here, so it proves that this is actually after that. You see that the signal actually splits. It goes towards the disc as well as towards the monitoring process at the same time in a parallel flow. So first thing we're going to do is just watch it go down. Now, the buttons that are in this picture are what we call logical. They're not necessarily physically in the flow, but they logically do this effect. So for instance, you can't get something to the disc unless it is armed and the record button is true. If both those things are true, then you'll get something recorded to the disc. Mute buttons are all over the place because when you mute something, it actually mutes it in multiple spots within the flow, and we'll show you that as we go through. So let's go ahead and print something to the disc. I'm going to arm the track. When I arm the track, you're going to see the input meter all of a sudden starts to show some input. Another way to see input is if I were to turn on the monitor button, you also see that flow come through into this thing. So either the monitor button or the arm button will cause the input meter to work. And then of course, when I hit the record button, it'll be printed to the disc. And then this is kind of a logical box here to show you what a track represents. The easiest way for me to think of a track in Studio One is a track is something that holds events. As strange as that sounds, that's really pretty much what it does. It allows you to define the inputs and outputs as well as holds the events, such as MIDI events or audio events. And we're going to go ahead and do that with the system and see what that looks like. So let's go ahead and just hit the record button. Okay, we'll go back to the diagram, and here you see we've actually printed on the disk, and we have a track on the disk actually reflected there. So when you hit the play button, of course that event comes back through the channel and goes through the rest of the system. So when we were actually recording that, we could hear it, and I wanted to show you that that was due to the fact that we were listening to the monitoring system, which was flowing all the way through here, all the way out to the main meters, and out through the main system to the video. We've printed something on the disk. Now let's go ahead and talk about the concept of a channel. And a channel is really the kind of the big daddy when it comes to all the abilities to control particular sounds within Studio One. So that begins with an input into the channel, and the first thing that happens is that goes through an insert rack, and we'll show you that that insert rack is actually pre the mute button or pre any of the pre or post synths. So let's go ahead and take a look at that in real life. First thing I want to do is go ahead and hit the play button. So this is coming off the disk on the diagram, flowing into the insert section. Here you see a signal picking up that event. And this is the output signal. Notice this is blue now instead of green. So if I go ahead and turn this down, it correspondingly turns down the meter and we don't hear anything. But if I turn down the input here, you see that I've actually turned down the output meter on the track. So this is affecting that output meter, but it's not affecting the meter before, which is the input meter coming into the track. This is the same level as the input meter here. So those two things prove that if we go over and look at the diagram, coming off the track, coming in, actually cutting the volume, showing up here. And this is, if we go ahead and move this thing all the way down, we'll see it has no effect on that volume right there. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. We still see that input. Now we're going to show that the mute button, one of the three logical mute buttons within the channel, is after the inserts but before the first pre-synths. Pre-synths are in yellow or golden color, and post-synths are in blue, and I'll show you how to turn those on and off. So we're going to demonstrate that muting this, we still see a signal here, but we don't see a signal here or here. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. This is a meter on the input of the channel, and this is a meter on the first pre-send. Notice how when I hit this button right here, it makes it pre or post. So this is a pre-send, and this is going to the EMT250, and the EMT250 has got a meter on it, and that's that meter right there. So we go ahead and hit the play button. We see our input meters and our send meters. Let's adjusting that right up and down this. You can see how it affects that meter. I'm going to go ahead and hit the mute button. You can see it killed our first pre-send, but the inserts are still operating as normal. So that proves that the mute button is after the inserts and before anything else on the channel. I'm going to go ahead and talk about the next thing here, which is the cue options and whether they're zero latency or not. I'm going to hold that off for a little bit later, and we're going to go ahead and move on to the fader, which you can see is really just controlling the output of the channel from the disk. And we'll talk about some peculiar arrangements here of the meter is actually before the pan, and we'll show you that. If I move the pan level, we won't see that change. So let's go back and look at the real thing. Now the first thing I want to show you is the pan. Now if I pan this thing to the right and left, you'll hear that in the video, but you'll see no effect on the meter there. That's just a heads up for if you're using this to try to adjust where you think a pan would be or see a pan, it's not going to show up there. Okay, so go ahead now, let's go ahead and look at the post sends on the diagram. So we've shown you that the pan is after the meter and after the channel. That is why we actually need another logical mute here, because a mute occurs here and a mute occurs here. So let's go ahead and take a look at the post send channel and prove to ourselves that this mute is killing that as well as killing this. Okay, so looking at the bus 1 is here. Bus 1 has got a meter on it. Here's bus 1 meter. We can see the signal as I up and down the post send. It affects that signal, you can see. But this signal is unaffected. And let's bring this back up again. And if I bring this down, it's actually going to affect both this signal going out to the mains as well as the send, because that is a post. It's after the send, the fader button. And when we do a mute on it, it actually mutes that send as well as that signal going out to the mains. So on the diagram, that looks like it's right here. This mute button is stopping this flow. It's also logically connected to this one, which is stopping that flow. And we know that there has to be one here in pre and post because we showed you that the pan is actually not affecting the meter. So it's actually stopping it before and after the panning of process. Let's talk a little bit about why people use post and pre-sends. Obviously, pre-sends can, if you bring down a fader, you're going to end up with completely, if you're sending this off to a channel that's doing a reverb or something, you're going to end up with purely a wet effect, and so that might be an effect you want where the dry effect just disappears and you remain, the wet effect stays there. And if you want a more a normal flow where the fader actually affects the overall effects downstream, then you would use a post one, which is by the default the one that is selected. Now, a lot of times people ask, what's the difference between an effects bus and a regular bus? In this diagram, I shows you the wiring of the two, and they're considerably different. An effects bus has a special ability on it where it automatically sets the solo safe on, which means whenever you're previewing a channel and you're soloing it, it does. This guy is saved from that muting process where what a solo really does in Studio One is it just mutes everything else. So when you press the solo button on this, which I don't have the solo buttons demonstrated on this diagram because they're nothing more than the opposite of muting everything. So in other words, a solo equals mute everything else, with the exception of when I put the save send on. That says save the safe solo, so don't mute it, even though you're muting everything else in the Studio One. And that button automatically is fired on when you set up an effects channel. Also, there's no pre or post ability to send off that bus. So that's what's unique about an effects channel. A regular bus has a pre and a post send on it, which allows you to send off to other buses or off to the mains, etc. And then the meters you see are, as they are over here in this situation, they are pre the pan level. So you won't, changing this pan level in a bus won't affect this guy. Where you will see these guys change in terms of pan. So if I change this pan, and since it's pre this send, and I have a send sent to, for instance, this bus, you will see that effect of that pan on this bus meter. One will go strong left or right, depending on where I'm at with that pan. So let's go ahead and take a look at that in real life. Let's just look at a pre-send. I'm going to go ahead and send out to an EMT 250, which is a reverb, and you're going to hear it, make it sound like a auditorium. So there you can see the signal coming in. Now, here's the effect of it being pre. If I kill the pan, the overall volume of the channel, you're still hearing the effect going through the effect volume. And bring back in the dry signal. So that's how that's kind of useful. Now what I'm going to show you is the effect of the solo on this effect bus. So when I hit the solo button, we're still hearing that reverb. Even though everything else has been muted, we're still hearing that reverb. And that's why you typically want to put effects on your effects buses, and that's why they invented it, so that you didn't have to screw around with that, and it just automatically worked that way. So now let's go ahead and take a look at a regular bus with its sends and it being post. On a post, if I go ahead and send this to bus 1, here you see it coming into bus 1. I also have bus 1 being sent out to a played effects bus as well as the main bus, just to kind of prove that we can do it. There's kind of nonsensical reason to do it, but just wanted you to match up with the diagram. Over here, of course, because it's post, when I bring the volume down, we lose everything. Bring that up, and then this is affecting the overall send out to the post, but we're still hearing that going to the plate reverb, even though this is all the way down. And bring that full volume back in, and that kind of gives you some overall, showing you basically what the difference is between a bus and an effects bus, considerably different. Now let's go ahead and deal with something that's a little hard to explain to people. I would think I'll show you a separate diagram, show you how cue mixes work and how zero latency cue mixes actually works within the ISO driver. Note the exact signal flow for zero latency monitoring is really only known by PreSonus designers. This block diagram is meant for demonstration purposes only and to explain the effect of zero latency monitoring on the user of Studio One if you're using it as a cue. And it's somewhat theoretical, but hopefully it will explain to you what's going on. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the zero latency cue off, just a normal flow. So the signal would start as an input coming in through your analog to digital converters, go through a very small buffer, approximately 1 millisecond, into your USB 2.0 device through the cable, into the RAM on your computer, which is where the VSL software is running. If you have it on, if it's not here, then it would just bypass this. This only takes a couple milliseconds to process the VSL software effects. So this is where you would apply your reverbs and echoes, etc., and do your compressions. Then it passes onto a buffer, input buffer. In this example, I'm using 256, and that's the demonstrated delay up there would be 13.6 milliseconds round trip. Take it all the way out. Take it through the Studio One software, which is going to do your PDC and for all your VST plugins and all that stuff. And then it's going to pass back out through a 256 output buffer, and then go to the USB cable and then out into a small buffer and back up into your digital to analog converter, and out to your speakers. So that's your flow, roughly a 13 millisecond time frame to go that complete flow. So when you click zero latency monitoring on, there's a handshake going on between PreSonus's hardware and their software to turn on and off zero latency monitoring flows. So the flow would look something like this. Once you clicked it on, it would come in through the analog to digital converter, flow to your USB cable, go through your VSL software if you have it on to add some reverb, etc., and then return directly out of the VSL software through the cable and out into your analog to digital converter. In addition to that flow, would also split here and also pass on through the buffers for the PreSonus software and into the recording process, and actually get recorded to the disk if you were to hit the recording button. Even though you would not hear this signal because you wouldn't be aware of that, you would be monitoring it. So what you'd be monitoring is just the flow through the VSL software directly, roughly 2 to 4 millisecond delay. And so the signal that you're adjusting when you're adjusting a cue, this is theoretically only is a control signal where data is being sent to the VSL software to adjust the output of that cue mix. So remember, cue mixes are always per an output. So if you set your cue mix for, let's say, output 3 and 4, you would be adjusting the volume of 3 and 4 in the VSL software in the cue mix. Because you're not going directly through the software when you're monitoring it, any kind of effects that you have on down here in the Studio One, you won't hear applied to the signal once you click on zero latency monitoring cues. Okay, what we're recording here is a drum coming in on 7 and 8, drum machine. This is my voice coming in here on 1. And you see the output coming out on DAW 3 and 4 from this cue mix. This is a cue mix with Z latency off. Now, if you notice when I turn on the reverb, you'll be able to hear the reverb. We're actually hearing what's going processed through the monitoring chain of S1, Studio One. Now, if I turn the zero or the cue mix zero latency on, watch the DAW stop, and the output is, remember, is directed to 3 and 4, and coming in through DAW 3, 4. Output to 3, 4. I turn on the Z latency. The signal drops here. But we still see the signal over here on 3 and 4. Coming into, in essence, where the video is being recorded on 3 and 4 in terms of the audio. So here you won't be able to hear the reverb anymore because it's in essence bypass the whole food chain inside of Studio One. And is using the signal within Studio Live One. I'll go ahead and just add some reverb to it so you can see that this is affecting it. You can see that signal is going through there. And this is controlling the overall volume. Watch 3 and 4. This is my voice and the drums. So I'm going to stop talking, but watch 3 and 4. So there's your proof that it's bypassing Studio One, with the exception of this controlling the volume of that output. So this channels mix into that output. To finish off the cue conversation, zero latency is off, then of course this just becomes like another send, and it's dedicated to an output channel. So this thing's going to go out here and go through an output cue, such as a fader and a cue for, I have mine in this example set up to outputs 3 and 4, and it's going to go out a separate path through your audio interface to a separate headphone amp. This is useful for when you are okay with your latencies, that maybe you can get a low enough latency in your system and you're only adding some reverb and you prefer using the reverb that's in Studio One. You're still going to get that, in this example, 13 milliseconds delay, but sometimes that just sounds like a kind of like a pre-delay on somebody's voice, and they would hear that voice coming through and may not notice the 10 millisecond delay. And that's good for sending out to different cue mixes, so you can have a send that maybe the bass player wants to hear the drummer better, maybe the drummer wants to hear the bass player better, and maybe the singer doesn't want to hear the bass player so much. So those allow you to send out different separate headphone amplifiers and adjust your cues accordingly and come up with different mixes. So that's useful for. So that's what that is useful for. While we're right here, I want to actually also talk about the click. Clicks actually have the ability to have their own mixes as well. Once you've turned click on in the system, it goes by default to the main meter output, and you're enabled here. There's a button right at the top of the system that shows you where that is enabled. And there's also a volume knob that you can adjust up and down for the volume of that click. You can also send your clicks out independently to each one of your cues. So, for instance, the drummer maybe wants the click to be real loud, but the singer doesn't want the click to be loud. So as you're recording, you can send different mixes out with different amounts of click to each one of the musicians that are recording, and that's useful. I think that pretty much wraps it up from the basic audio flow. So now let's go ahead and talk about the MIDI flow. MIDI comes in to the system through your external device, such as your keyboard, and it begins by selecting options, edit device, under your Studio One menu. You bring up your studio device. An example, this is my MIDI keyboard. I'm going to go ahead and open it up. Wait to show you what it's in there. And I've got channels that I want to receive on. I've got receive from which MIDI device. So this is showing me that my system has detected these MIDI inputs, and I've selected one of them to represent my kind of logical device within Studio One. And I can also define where I want to send out of. If I have this is a keyboard, so it doesn't have any sounds in it, so I don't want to send any MIDI out to it. And you engage the split channel option if you want to use separate instrument tracks to have separate MIDI channels for each one of them specifically called out. This allows you to send channel 1, channel 2, etc. And whether or not you want it to be your default instrument. In this particular case, this is my default instrument. So that's how MIDI begins in the flow. Starts here. Once you define that input device based on what your operating system has detected as a MIDI device and map it into that device, then that keyboard is able to input data into the system. Once the data has been defined in the device, it flows into Studio One. You'll first be able to see it show up in a monitor. Here you'll see keyboard notes being pressed, sending it on and off messages. And then you'll also be able to see it if you set up a software synth. Here you can see the keys being pressed on the software synth as the data enters into the software synth. Now these dash lines represent MIDI data, not audio data. So as it goes through the audio synth, there's really two flows that happens. One is an audio flow, which flows out through the path that we've already defined. And there's a MIDI flow that flows through the ARM process, record process, and gets recorded to the disk. Then is played back from the disk as a track via this event back into the soft synth or out to an external device. Now, if you're not using a soft synth, the MIDI data would be flowing down into the system through the same path to the disk. This is why when you're using a soft synth, you have to have the monitor button on in order to actually hear the output of the soft synth through the monitoring system. And the other thing to mention is the MIDI comes down here. You can monitor your MIDI through your MIDI monitor here, and that will show you that you have MIDI input. So this is a good input indicator. This is a good input indicator. There you go. That wraps up the Studio One flow. It's not perfect. It's been deduced from basically using the system. This should help people understand, what happened to their signal. What button do I have to press to hear this or not hear this? So some educating yourself on this basic flows certainly helps to quickly go through and debug and get a system set up for one particular case versus another. I find it useful even to look at a hard copy of this. On the website, I've supplied hard copies in both European and American size paper, and it's also available as a screen background in various different formats. If you want a particular size that's not available, just shoot me a PM and I can make something up for your particular screen. Kind of a handy thing to have around to just remember, to jog your memory about, okay, why am I not hearing this thing? Oh, yeah, that's right. I forgot to do this or I forgot to do that. I hope this helps you, and have fun making music in Studio One.